Okay, so one of the ways that they'll tend to show this or ask about when you have an exam is they'll ask about something called the Oxyhaemoglobin Dissociation curve. Now, all this is looking at actually is it's like a visual representation of how much oxygen is clinging to the haemoglobin at any given pressure, or I should say partial pressure of oxygen. Now a really clear example of that then is if we think back to when we talked about the alveoli. At the alveoli there's a very high partial pressure of oxygen, therefore because the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli is very high, we get 100% saturation of haemoglobin with oxygen as well within the red blood cells. On this graph that is shown here, so along the bottom we've got PO2, millimetres of mercury. That's basically what is the pressure of oxygen. A higher number means higher pressure. In the lungs we've got in excess of 100 millimetres of mercury. If we follow the dotted line up to this S-shaped curve that you'll see on this graph, you'll see that for a partial pressure of 100 we would have 100% saturation of haemoglobin with oxygen. Okay, so all of your red blood cells, all of the haemoglobin within your red blood cells is going to have 4 molecules of oxygen attached with all of them going to be full of oxygen in that situation. If we look at an area of the body though where there's going to be a lower partial pressure of oxygen, so if we look at like the muscle tissues for example, even during rest there's going to be a lower partial pressure of oxygen at the muscles. On this particular graph it's showing you that figure of 40. Okay, so the partial pressure of oxygen is only 40. Because it's lower, if we then follow the dotted line up again till we hit the S-shaped curve, we'll see that for a partial pressure of 40 we would only have 75% saturation of haemoglobin with oxygen. So if only 75% of the haemoglobin has got oxygen within it, or each haemoglobin molecule is only 75% saturated, so it's only carrying 3 out of the 4 oxygen molecules it could, what's happened to the rest of the oxygen? Well, it's very simple actually. The 25% that's missing, the 25% that's not accounted for, has been released by the haemoglobin, and that's then entered the tissues. It's entered the muscle tissue and it's being used for your internal respiration. Okay, so let's just run through that again. So we've got a high partial pressure of oxygen. So for example in the lungs, in the alveoli, which is 100, you'll have 100% saturation of haemoglobin with oxygen, so all the haemoglobin is still clinging to its oxygen, it's not giving any of it away. If you go to somewhere in the body such as your muscle tissues where there's going to be a lower partial pressure of oxygen, only 40 in this example, follow the dotted line up to the S-shaped curve and you'll see that only 75% of the haemoglobin is saturated with oxygen. That's because 25% of the oxygen has been released, it's been dissociated is the correct word, it's dissociated away from the haemoglobin and into the muscle tissue so it can be used for respiration. Okay, looking at the oxyhaemoglobin dissociation curve again, but this time looking at it what's happening during exercise. The first part remains the same, so if we look at areas where there's a high partial pressure of oxygen, look at the lungs again, partial pressure of oxygen there is at least 100 millimetres of mercury, follow the line up to the S-shaped curve, follow it across to percentage saturation of haemoglobin with oxygen, and you'll see that we are 100% saturated, so that part doesn't change. If however we go and look at the tissues, during exercise the partial pressure of oxygen at the tissues is much lower. Rather than it being 40 like it is at rest, it's dropped all the way down to 15. So because it's now only 15, if we go up and follow the dotted line now, and then we go to the S-shaped curve, then we go across, we can now see that haemoglobin saturation of oxygen is only 25%. So the haemoglobin actually only contains 25% oxygen. So what's happened to the other 75% of oxygen that it could potentially be carrying? Well, that's been given up to the muscle tissues because it's needed for internal respiration during exercise. So just to do that again, if we look at the lungs, we've got a high partial pressure of oxygen, 100. That means that we've got 100% saturation of haemoglobin with oxygen. If, however, we look at the muscle tissues, which during exercise have got a very low partial pressure of oxygen, so all the oxygen's being used up by those muscles. If we go up the dotted line to the S-shaped curve, go across, we can now see that there was a percentage saturation of oxygen for the haemoglobin of just 25%. So 75% of the oxygen that your haemoglobin was carrying has been given away, it's been absorbed, it's been diffused into that muscle to be used for respiration. So that's one of the major changes during exercise. Things basically flip completely. At rest, it was 75% saturation, 25% goes to the muscle. During exercise, it's only 25% saturation and 75% going into the muscle. So it's a big swing.